So I'll introduce the speakers first of all, and I'm really grateful to all the speakers for joining us today. This is quite an exciting one for me because I like trains, as people who've worked with me will probably know. So we've got 4 speakers today, which is unusual. Normally we only have 2 or 3, so we've added an extra one in today. So it's going to be a little bit tight, and I hope we'll keep to time. And Annie will probably kill me as usual because we won't keep to time, but we'll do our best to keep it within the sort of 30 minutes to 40 minutes time frame. And if our speakers and panelists can keep it brief as well, that would be wonderful. So we'll start with introducing you to the people. We've got Gareth Dennis, who's a rail engineer and writer, as well as star of YouTube. Does a lot of news commentary, so you'll see him occasionally on the BBC, etc., doing commentary on things like HS2, infrastructure design, and not to mention he does some great explainers around the design and history of railways as well. So if you are interested in that subject, he's one to look up on things like YouTube and his website. Now, Annie and I, as people will probably know, used to work for a big international construction consultancy. We were very lucky there to work with some really interesting and eminent people in their field, of which we have 2 on the line today. So we've got Rebecca Gabriel, who's head of risk at HS2. Rebecca's worked on some of the most significant projects around the country and beyond, and is part of the team now managing risk on what is probably the most high profile and possibly one of the most challenging projects in the UK at the moment, which is HS2. Raj Sanghera is also a very much respected member of the team at our old workplace. Raj has worked on HS2 in the past, but is now a senior planner for Homes England, based in Birmingham, where HS2 will obviously, as we know, be stopping first before it heads on its journey north. And then finally, and last but definitely not least, we're very grateful to Martin Burns of the RICS. Martin's a lawyer who spent his career working to encourage people not to use lawyers. Martin's also now head of the ADR, Alternative Dispute Resolution Research and Development at the RICS. So do let us have your questions. There's a Q&A box at the bottom, so use that if you can. Do feel free to use the chat, and can see some chat going on. Do excuse me if I don't get involved in the chat, because obviously I'm trying to marshal the questions and speakers and everything else. So it's but Annie is around, and she'll pick up on anything that you need to pick up on. So let's get to our first question. Hopefully everybody's in the room now. Gareth, possibly a bit of a controversial opener. HS2 is a big source of discussion for you. And many people have argued that we don't need it. There's obviously a lot of it was on the country file at the weekend. There's all sorts of discussions around, and now we've all learned to use Zoom. And there's the argument that we don't need to shave 10 minutes off our journey to Manchester. What is the purpose of driving a major piece of infrastructure like this through miles of unspoilt countryside?
Oh, so much to unpick. So let's first of all start by explaining what HS2 is for, because it's something that primarily government has purposefully and singularly failed to do, actually. If you trace right back to the earliest kind of, well, basically, if you have a look at the rail network in Britain, it's a jack of all trades and a master of none. So by that I mean you've got a huge mixture of different services. You've got local services stopping everywhere. You've got commuter services, regional services that kind of stop in a few places, travel fast through other places. You've got freight services in amongst it all. And the worst culprit of all for eating up capacity and kind of resulting in empty railway are the long distance services, the long distance high speed services. So the ones that run from, say, York to London directly, or from Manchester southwards without stopping anywhere. The reason why those eat up all the capacity is because if you can imagine, you've got a train that's not stopping anywhere, and in front of that is a train that is stopping everywhere. You've got to leave sufficient gap behind the train that's stopping at the station so that the fast train going 125 miles an hour doesn't catch up. What that means is you end up with a very empty railway with lots of gaps in the timetable and a very poorly optimized one. And so the best way to get a huge capacity release on the existing railway network is to take those long distance kind of high speed services off and put them onto their own infrastructure, allowing everything on the existing railway network to bunch up nice and closely together. So that results in a colossal, potential for 2 or 3 times the number of trains to actually run on the existing railway network than ran previously. So that's a huge leap in capacity. And why do we need this capacity leap? Given, we've got COVID and people are saying, oh, everyone can Zoom. Well, firstly, Only about 1 in 4 people can actually work from home in the long term. A huge number of people are currently furloughed that we keep forgetting about. Those people are generally those who have to work in, have geographical jobs where they actually have to go and work somewhere. They're also generally more likely to be women, people of color, people in lower income brackets. So it's quite privileged. We're all sat here probably quite comfortable, able to work from home, but it's other people who are not as well off as us, who are the ones who are benefiting from the capacity release on the existing network so they can get to their workplaces. And that's even more critical when people are going to be, the job market's going to be changing. People are going to need to be more flexible to be able to travel more to get jobs, given that COVID is going to result in a massive recession and a huge number of job losses, major change to the job market. So all of that notwithstanding, we also have climate change. 90% of people and things move by road in this country, and we need so in order to reduce our carbon emissions, our greenhouse gas emissions, transport is the largest source of greenhouse gas emissions in the UK, and most of that's road. In order to reduce those, we need more people to be traveling by sustainable transport. So it's not just rail, but also, cycling, buses, but having basically a very high capacity and high speed backbone for our transport network enables that shift by the released capacity for trains that people use. So, commuting trains, local trains. I don't know how many minutes I've been speaking. The last point I'm going to make is a way to think about this is if you go and stand at a local station, I don't know, somewhere like Wilmslow or Adderley Park or Retford, and count during rush hour how many trains don't stop at the station and how many trains do stop at the station, you'll find that you're kind of within the suburban sprawl of Manchester, say, and 2 trains stop maybe, or even 1 train is stopping per hour, and maybe 12 or more are passing through at full speed without stopping. That is what HS2 is about. It's about reversing that situation. So local stations start having 15 or 16 trains an hour rather than 1 or 2 during the rush hour. So that's really what it's about. And that's about leveling up, because within the M25, you turn up at a station, you don't care when the next train is, because one will turn up within minutes. Outside the M25 is a totally different story, and HS2 is a major part in reversing that. Have I got time to talk about the environment, or do you think that's a decent wrap up?
Let's pick up on the environment in a little while, because I want to also just cover the East-West Rail announcement that came up at the weekend. So we had the announcement that there was great funding being released for the East-West Rail. Is that good news as far as you're concerned, and is it as good as perhaps the press release thought it was?
Yeah, the press release was announcing money that already existed, was announced about 18 months ago. And actually, the only real news in the announcement was that East West Rail is going to be delayed by another year. So no, it wasn't really the good news announcement that Grant Shapps was trying to pretend it was. And it, unfortunately, it also contained the kind of the confirmation that the East West Rail will not be an electrified railway, which is kind of like introducing a railway without signalling or without track. It's like, no, electrification is part of building a railway that's not from the 1930s. So it's very bizarre for us to be building a new intercity main line that will carry a huge volume of passenger and freight traffic critically, without putting electrification in, bearing in mind that the cost of coming back and electrifying the railway at a later date will be absolutely enormous compared to just sticking it in, adding maybe 10% to the capital cost now. It's just a very, very bizarre approach. I mean, it's good news that the railway is being built, but I don't think we should be patting ourselves on the back as a country for building a railway with 1930s technology, frankly.
Yeah, it does seem strange not to electrify a railway in 2021 when we all know that everything is going to move to electric at some point. We've all been told that we're not allowed to have cars with internal combustion engines. What we think we're going to do with diesel.
And often people, I get the feedback, including from people with fairly high up in industry, which I find very disappointing, that, passengers don't care how their trains are powered. They don't really care. Well, they do care about how many seats they get an hour, and electric trains are lighter, cheaper to run, and accelerate better, so you can fit more of them on the track. They also care about the pollution in and around stations, which is immense from diesel engines, not just from, not just carbon soot, but also NOx and all these nasties. And they also they do actually care about the planet. They care about having a sustainable transport system. People do care about that. So I think it's a little bit disingenuous for a lot of people who say, no one cares about how trains are powered. Actually, passengers really do. Ultimately, more seats is what people care about more than anything for the railway system, and electrification enables that in a big way.
Good stuff. Okay, thanks, Gareth. Right, so Rebecca, obviously HS2 is a huge project. How do you manage the risk on something as vast as HS2, and what kind of tools and technologies are you using to identify those risks and manage change?
Thank you, Stuart. Thanks a lot. Thank you. Thanks, and thanks, Gareth. That was really good in terms of how we linked everything together. So we all know the sheer scale of HS2, the largest infrastructure program in the Europe itself, that is being delivered across multiple phases. For us, first and foremost, it's key and fundamental to recognize that different phases will be in different stages of their life cycle. At HS2, we try to simplify things through the application of standard best practices. Keep things simple is a mantra at the heart of everything. Our risk management process has guiding principles that's underpinned by ISO 31000 principles. So we operate in a very integrated way, in a very transparent way with our integrated project partners, our stakeholders, DFT, etc. The world's changed so much, and how in the last 1 year. So there's a need for us to be dynamic, to continuously review what's being done. In terms of the process itself, we just apply a 5-stage process. That's an industry standard. So it is just you identify, you assess, you ensure that there's a treatment plan in place, you respond and you review. So that's your standard industry process. We're not trying to do anything innovative, but we want to be robust. We want to ensure that all known threats and all known opportunities are identified. So we are constantly self-assuring ourselves as well at HS2. So we have a risk control assure framework, and our work is, it goes through 3 layers of defense mechanism in terms of how we do. We apply reference class forecasting. It's a method of predicting the future, whereby we look at similar projects at key milestones. We see where our costs are, etc. We have open discussions and regular workshops with our stakeholders. We bring them in to make sure we are gathering on their knowledge and their intel. So cyclical review of our risk register. At HS2, every decision is based on the information that we know, and it's a risk-based decision. That's key to us in order to help achieve our strategic objectives. In terms of some of the tools that we use Exactium, which is industry standard used by the likes of Highways England. So again, very similar. And then we add an additional layer of assurance because we want to be innovative. We are in such a place and a responsibility to bring in the innovation and drive in best in class thinking in as well. So we're constantly working with our peers in order to be able to do that. We enterprise dynamic analytic tools to show us what is our data telling us. HS2, for the very first time, it hosts all office contractors' data on our platform so that we can work with them in an integrated manner, but also use the data to help us inform our decision-making process. So while on one hand, we've kept it simple so that it's easy for everyone to understand, on the other hand, we're constantly ensuring it's not only best in class, but we are innovating as well at HS2. Thank you, Stuart. Hopefully that's answered your query.
Yeah, that's a brilliant
question.
overview. Thank you. And I'll pick up. I have looked up that little tool while you were talking, the Exactium, that little tool, which I'm sure is not a little tool at all. But yeah, we'll pop the link into to that to people later. We'll follow this up to anyone that's on the line and the people who haven't made it on this morning, with a little roundup of what was said this morning, and a little summary. So, Raj, good morning. And so for you, obviously you've worked at HS2 in the past, but now you're at Homes England. How important is all this infrastructure to the planning that you do? And how does your planning tie in with the risks that other organisations manage to ensure that everything links up?
Thanks, Stuart. I'm going to start by just introducing what Homes England is and what we do, because a lot of people have heard the name, heard it passed around, but aren't probably quite sure what we actually deliver. So Homes England is the government's housing accelerator, for our tagline term. And what we effectively do is we unlock difficult sites. In essence, we pick up sites with inherent risk. So if it's difficult, that's what we like. If it was easy, that's for someone else to do. Our main driver is delivering units to the market as quickly as possible. And that's done by several different sites, one of them being brownfield sites, which are within the city walls, sort of focusing on Birmingham. You've got HS2 coming into Curzon Street Station, which is the Digbeth end of Birmingham, if anybody knows Birmingham well. and we've got a few brownfield sites there, and some of the risks that come up from that, the usual sort of contamination, nasties in the ground, that kind of thing, which we end up dealing with ourselves, and then sort of the type working within a city centre. How that affects how that's affected by HS2 is the close working that HS2 is a bigger project, tends to take priority over ours, and that caused some issues with sort of planning, getting it through to a live stage of work, and the ultimate delivery. I suppose some of the easy ones that we look at, which everyone considers the greenfield sites, which are a bit more out in leafy areas, and those are sort of large schemes of 3,000 to 5,000 houses. The infrastructure requirements for those can vary from huge power requirements. So tying into what Gareth was saying about how electricity is sort of the way everyone's heading. By 2025, we're expecting that there'll be no gas on site for housing. So there'll be, it'll be all powered, all heating will be powered by electricity or other forms of heating. And what that's doing is shifting the power requirements on a site. So we're a site of, say, 1,000 units. 1,000 houses. I've got to stop saying units. 1,000 houses would be 2-3 MVA if it was part gas powered and part electricity powered. Now, if it's fully electricity powered and we're going to EV charging points for electric cars, you're talking 10 MVA. So, you're almost tripling the requirements. So, as a capacity issue, utility providers, aren't set up for that. A lot of these leafy green sites, the greenfield sites, aren't close to a primary substation. So, you're looking at running cables miles, whereas before, in the city, it's a lot easier to get to. And then some of these sites cut across the HS2 main line or are in close conjunction to. So finding when you can get that working, when you can get your power outages, when you can deliver that infrastructure for your houses, basically. And what we're finding at the moment is HS2 is a bigger project, takes a bit more priority, which is understandable. It's a countrywide rather than a regional thing. I suppose one of the other things that we're looking at as well is for these bigger sites, we're putting in a lot more infrastructure in terms of roads. So some of these sites that we've got have been stalled for 10 years because they need a bypass or they need a link road or something like that. And when you're working with local authorities or county authorities, they're going to look at their road booking sort of programs well in advance to understand when they can block off areas so that we can put these roads in for them. But again, that ties into HS2 in that if HS2 are doing work in that area, they'll then take priority for getting their section of work done before we can block off any other roads and work on the capacity that the road network can handle. I think that sort of a general risk that we Gareth and I talked about actually yesterday, and you mentioned, was the capacity for engineering skills and labour skills within the market. And that's something we're looking at as Homes England, just in the central region. We're delivering in excess of 15,000 houses in the next 10 years, and delivering the infrastructure is going to take some significant work from main contractors. So it's just understanding how HS2 is going to soak up that market, the labour, the skills, and if we are going to have a shortage in the UK.
Brilliant. Okay, thanks, Raj. That is really interesting, particularly the way that you tie in with the HS2 and the fact that as we were saying yesterday, you could have all. What was it? Gareth's point was something like you could have all the funding you like in the world, but the labour market is still going to be limited to what you've got in terms of labour. And if you want to build homes and HS2 and this and that, you're still limited by the skill shortage in the labour that we have. So Martin, so Raj and I met years ago while working for a firm that was dealing with disputes and ironing out disputes on various major infrastructure projects around the country and the world. And the RICS are obviously quite heavily involved in trying, as we said, your role is to try and help people avoid that. So what sort of initiatives are going on at the RICS to try and particularly in regard to infrastructure? I know there's some things that you've set up and some systems that you've put in place. So what's going on at the RICS? How can we avoid things going wrong?
I think an answer, Stuart, to the question is what's going on at RICS is a lot. and in fact too much to try and squeeze into the time we've got here. But I think listening to the earlier speakers, what's come clear, and indeed the subject matter of this session today is all about risk, and the success of any infrastructure project really does depend to a large extent on good planning. And parts of that good planning, of course, is looking and analysing and assessing risk. And one of the biggest risks to any construction infrastructure project is disputes. Disputes cause a massive amount of delays. They cause an immense amount of disruption in terms of relationships and everything else. And of course, they add immense cost to a project. And in my experience, very often in that early stage in coming together to develop a project, to put the contracts together, nobody really wants to talk about disputes. And there's people I've talked to who say, "Oh, it'll never happen to me," or in my experience, all my career, 10 years, I've never had a dispute. Well, if that was true, then I wouldn't be doing the job I've been doing for the last 30 years. Disputes happen, and they happen when you don't want them to happen. And the thing about the way to resolve disputes through adjudication and arbitration, what you find then is when people eventually end up in a dispute, they start rifling through the contract to see what it says about how to resolve it. And of course, you have these adversarial processes called adjudication and arbitration, which perversely I'm a fan of, but at the same time, they happen too late. By that time, you've got the lawyers involved, the commercial people have lost control, and it goes off into a hole where the lawyers then start to deal with it on a legal basis, and eventually you get a decision, and everybody has to pay for it. I say I've worked in my job for 30 years. I work across all sectors where charter surveyors get involved, in property, commercial property, telecoms, CPO, agricultural land. The most fertile ground I found for disputes is being construction and engineering. And we find, I've heard recently, I know you've probably seen this, that the government has announced that it expects after the second quarter of this year to be a tidal wave of disputes in the construction and engineering sector. I could say, working for RSCS, in fact, we've already seen at RSCS a 20 to 25% increase in the numbers of construction disputes happening across the UK. And their disputes are going off to adjudication and in some cases to litigation, which I'd always counsel people never to end up in court, as you said right at the very beginning, Stuart. Now, we at RSCS, we're expecting government to scope legislation because we work closely with government organisations like the Construction Leadership Council, like BAYS and other departments. We're expecting the government is going to look at how it can mitigate against this increasing potential for disputes, both in the short term and in the long term. And I think in the short term, it's very much about, you can't stop the tide coming in. You have to look at how can you mitigate and deal with these in a very quick and effective way. But in terms of long-term planning, RSCS is working with not just the government, but with a whole raft of other professional organisations and industry bodies in the rail sector in particular, Network Rail and Transport for London, for example, to try, if you like, encourage a culture change in the industry, away from this sort of traditional claims conscious attitude to a culture which there is greater collaboration, where parties actively engage with each other to avoid disputes. And of course, people are people. You can't always avoid disputes. So when a disagreement happens, to have this culture that when differences emerge, to deal with them early and effectively. Now, that might sound pie in the sky, but actually it's not, because we've already seen Network Rail and Transport for London engage in conflict avoidance and early intervention methodologies that actually work. And the investment in them has been minimal, but the cost savings have been immense. And the statistics, which I haven't got time to show you here, particularly those produced by Transport for London, which showed that once they've implemented an early intervention device to try and deal with conflicts early, and this is something that RSCS helped them to develop, that it's managed, the numbers of compensation claims, for example, fell off a cliff. And the amount of claims that turned into actual disputes just disappeared altogether. And the fact that the rail industry has taken a lead in this, I think, is hugely encouraging. And RSCS is now working with government departments and with the likes of the Institution of Civil Engineers, REBA, the Chartered Institute of Arbitrators, the International Chambers of Commerce, and a whole raft of other organisations to try and push this high idea of including within risk analysis the facility to put in place conflict avoidance and early intervention mechanisms right at the beginning to allow those people who are involved in the project, the commercial managers, the directors, to retain control over the outcome of differences of opinion and not hand it over to lawyers and end up in court or arbitration or adjudication. So we're working with this sort of pan-industry conflict avoidance coalition. It's formed a steering group. I sit on that steering group, along with some very senior people from Network Rail and Transport for London and other organisations. And we believe that there is a need maybe for a top-down approach to put in place facilities where people will begin to think about addressing the potential for disputes and conflict much earlier than they have in the past. And a real positive output of this has been the Conflict Avoidance Pledge. And if you don't or haven't heard of the Conflict Avoidance Pledge, please go onto the RSS website, rss.org/CA Pledge, all one word. This was something that the steering group had developed, and what it does is it invites organisations to commit to exploring ways to manage and deal with conflicts much more effectively, much more amicably and collaboratively, and at an earlier stage than they might otherwise have done in the past. The pledge to date has been signed by over 200 organisations and some huge organisations as well. You know, the likes of Skanska and Siemens and Heathrow Airport. A lot of organisations have signed up to this. The pledge has been endorsed by the Cabinet Office in its guidance on responsible behaviours to contracting parties. The pledge forms one of the 12-point recovery plan that the Welsh Government has put in place for its post-COVID construction and recovery. And indeed, just a few weeks ago, the government, of course, produced its construction playbook. And within the playbook, there is a statement that contracting parties should adopt the pledge, and not just sign up to the pledge, but actually adopt the principles that are in there. And as I say, RSS has taken the lead in pushing the pledge and pushing forward techniques and methods that parties can use to avoid and manage disputes much better. As I say, Stuart and others, you know, I could talk about this for quite some time, and I told Stuart quite jokingly the other day, I rehearsed this and took an hour and 3/4 to say all I wanted to say. But from now, I think I'll leave it there. But I would encourage people to think about what I've said and perhaps also look at the RSS website for more information about the pledge and the work of the coalition.
Brilliant, thanks, Martin. There are so many things going on, and I think, you know, to keep on top of them is almost impossible. But yeah, taking a look at things like the CAP and stuff like that is a good place to start. Just out of interest, people on the line have a show of hands button on their screens if you can find it. Could you just raise your hand if you're familiar with the construction playbook, because that was something that was announced recently, and I'm not sure how many people are familiar with that. A decent number of people. Oh, that's good. The word is getting out there. So yeah, so that's something again that the government announced, and I'm not sure how many people, you know, people have heard of it, how many people are familiar with it. There was a webinar last week that I attended that gave a little bit more detail about it, but that's another thing to look into. So again, we'll put a link in that into the piece that we write up afterwards. Finally, I think there's a few questions, Q&A things come in, so that's good. So I think we'll move on to those. So firstly, what are the key risks, somebody's asked, to be mitigated for construction of new HS2 stations from both an employer and contractor's perspective? So Gareth, I think seeing as you've been very patient and quiet since the start, can we come to you first on the kind of what the key risks for railway stations are?
Yeah, I mean, from the contractor's perspective, it's probably changes to how they can get stuff in and out of the site. I think with the major stations, a large number of them are slap bang in the center of cities. So from a contractor's perspective, logistics, just like any operations, really, military, transport, engineering, whatever it is, the logistics are really the most important thing. And getting this stuff in and out of sight is a real challenge. And the risk associated with that, of course, in city centres and kind of urban areas where you're building these stations, there's also massive utilities risk as well. So in all the bits and pieces, Raj is nodding vigorously because Homes England, I imagine that's 90% of your time is spent dealing with dodgy utilities or unrecorded utilities. Yeah. So when I say utilities, sorry, it's a very jargon word. What I mean is, gas pipes. When it comes to London, rivers that someone's hidden, sewers, high voltage power lines, low voltage power lines, fiber optic cables that someone's dropped somewhere without realizing, all sorts of utilities that get buried that we do our very best as railway engineers to keep on top of and understand where they are. But even on the existing railway, on what looks like quite a straightforward bit of railway line in the middle of the countryside, we can find utilities that we didn't expect to be there. So in the middle of a city like Birmingham or Manchester or London, it's a major threat. So yeah, logistics and utilities, I think, would be the two that I jump to. I don't know if that answers the question.
Yeah, sure. And Rebecca, have you got any other things that come up from an employer's perspective, from the HS2 perspective?
Thank you, Stuart. Thanks. So from an employee's perspective, I think the largest risk that's sitting on a risk register is a COVID and its impact. I think Gareth previously mentioned that we have the funding. It's not the funding, but the labor market for construction was always very limited. And COVID is impacting it further by 26%. So it's a compounded effect, and who knows what Brexit is going to throw on it as well. So that's something that we're very, very closely monitoring. And something else to add to what Gareth previously said in terms of the contractors' risk. On HS2, we have an onerous technical assurance requirement, rightly so, learning from Crossrail and other examples, where we want to make sure it's not about building, it's about making sure that the seamless operation flows through as well. So on one hand, you've got the logistics, the utilities, the stakeholder management, etc. But the technical requirement is quite onerous on HS2 as well, which is recognized and it's top on the risk register from our end. Thank you.
Brilliant. Thank you. And a question for Martin from David Evans. Martin, would you, and indeed anyone else that wants to comment, but agree that the frequency of formal dispute procedures is related more to profit margins than anything else? And also, isn't it less desirable to end up in arbitration proceedings than court? So is arbitration worse than court in your view, Martin? And is profit a driver for dispute resolution?
I think there's some truth in this, in the sense that, very often contracts are awarded to the lowest bidder. And what happens then is that you have a relationship where the contractor is really looking to see how it can make the best of the very narrow margin situation it's in. And you end up with a situation where they try and manage the relationship in order to increase, if you like, the revenue generation through it. I think that then creates almost an adversarial relationship right from the very start. And that then creates the tendency for disputes to be referred to adjudication. And it's not just me saying that, that's clearly something I've heard also on the steering group from the likes of Transport for London and Network Rail, who are experiencing this in real time. And to be fair to them as organisations as well, they're looking to see how they can address that, and not just simply award contracts to the lowest tender, and try and manage the relationship with their supply chain in a much more amicable, risk-sharing way. Is arbitration more expensive than court? Well, certainly that historically was the view. And when I first worked with RSS back in the 90s, I hate to say that, but that's true. I often came across situations where arbitrations took longer and cost more than if you had ended up in court. I think that's less so today. One of the natural reasons is that arbitration is used far less than it has been in the past, simply because more people use adjudication. But I think there's also a new approach now to arbitration that organisations like RSS and IC and others are adopting, which is encouraging much more better management of arbitration. And arbitration, when it's used properly, can be very effective, cost effective. And of course, you always get somebody who's deciding the dispute that really does understand the nature of the beast that has to be resolved.
Yeah, I think that's probably a good point, actually. And does anyone else have any thoughts on dispute resolution that they want to throw in before I ask one final question?
I was just going to say, from my experience, and I think you'll have seen this, Stu, and our previous employer, when the market goes a bit tight, you do tend to see more disputes coming out, and whether that's because profit margins have dropped or people in some cases are buying jobs and going for the cheapest price of work, not realizing that's going to come back and bite them, the further end. So I think that there is a correlation definitely seen at the last downturn. Who knows what it's going to bring coming forward.
Good stuff. Yeah. Cheers. Yeah. I think, who knows what's going to happen next. So, and as somebody, one of the people who's already just asked a question said that the next 6 months could certainly be more interesting than the previous 6 months. So, right, very finally, I do want to come back to Gareth, because we did say if we had time, and I think we've got a little bit of time just to squeeze in that bit about the environment. And obviously, when I was watching Countryfile at the weekend, they made quite big news of the destruction of Tree of the Year. And what is the impact on the environment, and how, I guess the question to address is what mitigation is being put in place for the environment as a result of HS2, Gareth?
Yeah, so I think very, very quickly, I'll go through some of the key myths that I hear. So one of them is about the fact that there's, the HS2 is the largest deforestation project since the First World War, which is nonsense on a number of levels. It's just completely made up, and strangely enough, by the kind of the Institute of Economic Affairs, I think, made that one up. So it's a bit strange that green left-wing groups are jumping on it. But the 108 woodlands being destroyed is also not true. So the best way to see what the impact on woodland looks like is to see some of the aerial views of Broadwell's Wood, which is the ancient woodland that HS2 is having the biggest impact on. And it is a large swathe of woodland. But if you look at the aerial view, it's still a pocket. It's not field sized. It's the size of a small pocket of woodland that's been felled. And HS2, if you look at all the other woodlands, all the other ancient woodlands, HS2 has been, I know this because I worked a little bit on some of the alignments up near Calvert. HS2 is very, very carefully designed to tweak through it and cut through these ancient woodlands at their very narrowest point, other than Broadwell's. The reason why it cuts through a larger part of Broadwell's is because of a village next to it. So get that aerial view, and that's the best way to see what the impact is, because that's the largest impact is at Broadwell's, and it is very small. So it's about having a bit of perspective. Also, the 120-year carbon thing is often repeated. Again, that's looking at a very narrow view of HS2's own little carbon bubble and not thinking about the bigger picture, about the policy. There needs to be policy and wider transport changes to make the best of HS2, but the 120-year carbon thing isn't even true in its own measurement. So in terms of mitigation, ignoring the fact that HS2 is useful transport-wise, there is a huge amount of defragmentation environmental work going on. New habitats being created. HS2 is the largest habitat kind of project going on in Europe, as well as being the largest infrastructure project. There's a huge HS2 call it the Green Corridor. I don't like to use too much jargon, but they call it the Green Corridor, and it is a reasonably adept, sensible name for it. So yes, there is this line going through as a transect, and you could argue with creating fragmentation of habitat, which is a bad thing. My dad's a land use ecologist, by the way, so I nerd out on this stuff. But actually, by planting huge amounts more tree, I think it's 40 times more habitat is being created, protected, new habitat to grow than is being impacted on. And it's actually stitching together lots of existing habitats as well. So actually reducing the amount of habitat fragmentation. You're resulting in this incredible green strip of habitat that's being protected and that was formerly, arable monoculture. So actually, from an environmental perspective, it is about perspective. I think a lot of the campaigners have lost perspective on the bigger picture. The analogy, I'll close with the analogy, which is that HS2 is a bit, the environmental impact, the habitat impacts of HS2 are a bit like not taking your COVID jab because of the little pinprick. That's an analogy which I quite like.
Brilliant. Okay, thank you very much, Gareth. I have to say, I'm really grateful to everyone for joining us today, but I could listen to Gareth talking about railways till the cows come home, and I was a bit worried that if I managed to get Gareth involved in one of these, I'd just sit here talking about trains all day. So I hopefully managed to avoid doing that. So thank you all very much indeed. I'm going to close it there. Apologies if we didn't come to your question. We will keep doing these construction cast events and probably until and beyond the release of lockdown and all of the other things that are going on at the moment. We've got another session. The next session we're hoping to put together will probably be on litigation funding at some point in February. So keep an eye out for that if litigation funding gets you excited. We'll keep going. Thank you all very much for attending and listening. We will try and get a summary and the recording, if everybody's happy with it, up onto YouTube and the website soon, and hopefully speak to you all again soon. Thank you all very much indeed.